The air hung thick and metallic, the kind of smell that clings to rust and forgotten things. I leaned against the grimy railing, the cold seeping through my threadbare jacket. Below, the murky water churned, indifferent. My world had shrunk to this view, this perpetual twilight of regret. Years had passed since the badge was taken, since the whispers turned to shouts, since that case became the shadow that followed me. Now, my nights were a dull ache, punctuated by the distant hum of the city and the ghosts of faces I couldn't save. A siren wailed, a mournful cry that cut through the usual urban drone. It wasn't close, not yet, but it was enough to stir the embers of an old habit. My eyes scanned the skyline, tracing the distant flashing blues. A jolt, faint but undeniable, ran through me. It was the same disquiet that used to precede the worst nights, the nights when the city bled. I'd been nursing a lukewarm coffee in a diner that smelled of stale grease and desperation when the news crackled on the ancient television mounted above the counter. A robbery. Not just any robbery, though. They'd hit a high-end jewelry store downtown, a place I knew, a place that prided itself on its impregnable security. And what's truly baffling, authorities say, the reporter continued, her gaze fixed on some unseen cue, is the method, the entry point, the disabling of the alarms, the sheer audacity of it all. It's remarkably sophisticated, almost as if whoever did this knew exactly where every weakness lay. My hand, already tight around the chipped ceramic mug, clenched, knew exactly where every weakness lay. I pushed myself away from the counter, the cheap vinyl of the stool groaning in protest. I walked out into the indifferent night, the city lights a smear of neon across the damp pavement. My old apartment, a cramped space above a noisy bar, was a sanctuary of sorts. It was here, surrounded by stacks of unsolved case files and the ghosts of my former life, that I tried to piece together the fragments of myself. But tonight, the fragments felt sharper, more dangerous. I turned on the small, flickering television, tuning into the local news. The same report, this time with grainy security footage. A blur of movement, efficient and silent. No forced entry, no broken glass. The cameras, state-of-the-art, had been bypassed with an almost surgical precision. And then the detail that made my breath hitch. A small, almost imperceptible scratch on the floor near a ventilation shaft, a mark I'd seen before, a signature I'd prayed I'd never see again. It was him, or someone who knew him. The man I'd hunted for months, the one who'd left a trail of calculated chaos and then vanished, leaving me broken and disgraced. They called him the architect in the hushed tones of the precinct. He was a phantom, a ghost who moved through the city's underbelly, leaving no trace but the indelible stain of his actions. The architect's MO was unique, a complex dance of planning and execution that defied easy explanation. He didn't just rob, he dismantled. He didn't just steal, he exposed. And the scratch, that tiny, almost invisible mark on the floor, was his calling card, a twisted flourish at the end of his meticulously crafted crimes. The heist was just the beginning, I knew it. A test, a rehearsal. He was back, or he had a protege. And this time the stakes were higher. The reporter had mentioned the target was a private collection, a vault rumored to hold items of immense historical and financial value, not just jewelry. This wasn't about petty cash. This was about power, about control. I was no longer the detective who had a chance. I was just Cole, a man adrift, haunted by the echoes of my failures. But the sight of that scratch, that familiar, insidious mark, had ignited something. A flicker of the old fire, a desperate urge to step back into the inferno. The next morning, the air felt different. Not cleaner, but charged with a nervous energy. I found myself drawn to the waterfront, the smell of brine and diesel, a stark contrast to the stale air of my apartment. I needed to see it, to confirm my gut feeling. The International Bridge during shift change. A nexus of activity, a place where the city's pulse beat strongest. A place where a ghost could easily disappear. I stood near the access road, the morning fog swirling around my ankles like spectral tendrils. The shift change was a ballet of trucks and cars, a constant flow of movement. The security presence was heavy, a visible deterrent. But I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that if the architect was involved, those visible deterrents meant nothing. They were part of the facade, the predictable elements he'd already accounted for. Then I saw it. A small, almost invisible glint of metal near the base of a support pillar, partially obscured by a discarded oil drum. A discarded tool, perhaps, or something more. My heart, a muscle I'd long thought numb, gave a painful lurch. It was a tiny piece of metal, intricately shaped, unlike anything I'd ever seen used in a common break-in. It was precise, almost delicate, a craftsman's tool. My breath caught in my throat. The jewelry store heist, the meticulous planning, the unique entry method, and now this. It wasn't just a resemblance anymore. It was a declaration. He was back, and he was leaving his mark not just on the city, but on me. The question was no longer if I could stop him, but if I even had the right to try. The ghosts of the past were whispering, urging me forward, but the shadow of my own failure loomed, a constant, suffocating reminder of what I had lost. The chill bit deeper than usual, seeping through the worn fabric of my jacket as I stood on the observation deck of the International Bridge during shift change. Below, the river was a sliver of obsidian, reflecting the garish glow of the city lights like a scattered handful of jewels. A humid wind, thick with the scent of brine and exhaust fumes, whipped my hair across my face. Shift change. The briefest lull in the constant hum of commerce, a moment when the guards, the drivers, the watchers, they all blinked. A fraction of a second where the world held its breath. My hand, already tight around the chipped ceramic mug, clenched. The words echoed in the hollow space where my confidence used to reside. It had been the precinct's offer, a pathetic attempt at a peace treaty after they'd tossed me out like yesterday's garbage. I'd taken it, of course. Couldn't resist the bitter irony. Now, here I was, breathing in the stale air of a place I once patrolled, a place that felt both intimately familiar and utterly alien. The official channels were a labyrinth I had no desire to navigate again. They'd closed the book on the Phantom years ago, chalking up the unsolved disappearances and meticulously executed thefts to a ghost. The Phantom wasn't a ghost. He was back, and he was evolving. A sleek black sedan idled near the service entrance, its tinted windows like a veil. I recognized the silhouette of the driver immediately, even from this distance. The same stoic posture, the same unnerving stillness. He was a ghost of sorts himself, a fixture of this bridge, a man who saw everything and said nothing. I'd always found him unsettling, a silent sentinel with eyes that seemed to pierce the fog. I walked towards him, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the relative quiet. The metallic tang of the bridge's aged infrastructure filled my nostrils. As I approached, the driver's side window hummed and lowered, revealing a face etched with the anonymity of countless watchful nights. He offered no greeting, just a slow, deliberate nod. "You're cold," he stated, his voice a low rumble, devoid of inflection. "Used to be," I corrected, my own voice rougher than I remembered. "What do you want?" He extended a gloved hand, offering a small, rectangular object, a thumb drive. "Information for you." I hesitated, my gaze flicking to the data port on the side of his dashboard. This felt too easy, too convenient, but the gnawing suspicion in my gut was a more potent force than caution. "What kind of information?" "Patterns," he said, his eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance. "The new ones, they're cleaner, faster, but the signature, it's there, faint like a watermark on a forged document." I took the drive. It felt cool and smooth in my palm. "Who sent you?" He offered a faint, almost imperceptible shrug. "The river sees all, the bridge hears all, some things just find their way." That was it. No explanations, no payment demanded. Just a cryptic delivery. I could feel the familiar prickle of unease, the sensation of being a pawn in a game I didn't fully understand. But the mention of patterns, of a signature, that was the hook. Back in my cramped apartment, the air thick with the scent of stale cigarette smoke and old paper, I plugged the thumb drive into my battered laptop. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of encrypted files. This wasn't amateur hour. This was calculated. precise. The Phantom had always been meticulous, his crimes a testament to his intellect. But these heists were different. I started with the first file, a log of the most recent incident, a secure vault emptied in a city 300 miles away. The security footage was a blur of expertly disabled cameras and motion sensors bypassed with an almost supernatural grace. No forced entry, no alarms tripped, just gone, like smoke. My fingers traced the edges of the grainy stills on my screen, details I'd seen before. Then came the second file. Another heist, another city, another impossible feat. This time, a private collection of rare artifacts vanished from a heavily guarded estate. The same surgical precision, the same utter lack of evidence. The Phantom's calling card wasn't just the method, it was the audacity, the sheer nerve. I scrolled through the rest, each file a testament to a ghost's resurgence. The Phantom's original modus operandi had been about disruption, about sowing fear. These new heists were about acquisition, about refinement. It was like watching a sculptor hone their craft, each iteration more perfect, more terrifying. And then I saw it. A single, almost invisible anomaly in the third file. A tiny scratch, barely perceptible on the underside of a display case. It was out of place, a deviation from the otherwise perfect execution. A tremor ran through me. I remembered that scratch. I'd spent weeks poring over crime scene photos, searching for anything at all that could lead me to him. That scratch. It had been on the edge of my memory, a phantom limb of a thought I couldn't quite grasp. My own hands began to tremble. This wasn't just a pattern. This was a message, a taunt. He knew I was looking. He knew I was still haunted. And he was showing me with every perfectly executed crime that he was still out there, still playing his deadly game. The weight of it all pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. The ghosts of my past were no longer confined to my nightmares. They were real and they were back on the streets. I had to stop him, before he disappeared again, or worse, before he decided to start leaving more than just scratches. The chill of the pre-dawn air bit at my exposed skin as I stood on the observation deck, the vast, skeletal frame of the International Bridge during shift change stretching out before me. A river of headlights flowed in both directions, a restless current of metal and ambition. The night shift, a weary, hunched collection of figures, began their slow exodus, replaced by the brighter, more alert faces of the day crew. It was a ballet of routine, a well-rehearsed choreography of borders and commerce. My contact, a man whose face I'd only ever seen shrouded in the gloom of a bar booth, had been maddeningly vague. The next one, Cole, he'd rasped, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and regret. It's bigger, more public. He'd pressed a crumpled napkin into my palm, a single address scrawled on it in thick black ink. Watch, understand. I understood, all right. The prickle of unease had blossomed into a cold dread. This wasn't just about stolen goods anymore. This was about a performance, a twisted spectacle designed to be seen. The previous heists, though audacious, had been surgical. A small-town bank, a discreet jewelry exchange. Clean, efficient. But this location, this was a statement. The address led me to a sprawling warehouse complex on the city's industrial fringe, a forgotten kingdom of corrugated iron and rusting machinery. It was an unlikely target for a smash and grab, but my gut churned with a certainty that belied the seemingly random choice. I found a vantage point on an adjacent, derelict building, the cracked concrete crumbling beneath my worn boots. The air here tasted of damp earth and decay, a stark contrast to the sterile efficiency of the bridge. Then another. Not the clumsy scramble of ordinary thieves, but a fluid, almost synchronized advance. They moved with a preternatural stillness, like predators assessing their prey. They carried no visible weapons, a detail that struck me as odd, then deeply unsettling. They approached the main warehouse doors, a hulking expanse of steel. There was no forced entry, no crowbar symphony. Instead, one of them produced a small, metallic disc. He pressed it against the lock mechanism. A soft click echoed in the stillness, and the massive doors swung inward with a sigh of ancient hinges. My breath hitched. This was beyond anything I'd seen. This was precise. Inside, the warehouse was vast, a cavernous space filled with stacked crates and shrouded machinery. The figures fanned out, their movements economical and purposeful. They didn't rummage or smash. They went directly to a specific section, marked by a single overhead fluorescent light that hummed with a dying energy. Here, rows of identical, unmarked metal containers stood in neat formation. I watched, my gaze locked on the scene as they worked with an almost surgical precision. They opened two of the containers. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. What were they taking? Not money, not jewels. These were industrial supplies, specialized equipment, the kind of components that didn't just disappear. They were used. Then the unexpected happened. A lone security guard, a portly man with a flashlight beam that wavered like a nervous heartbeat, rounded a corner. Before he could even raise his flashlight, one of the figures moved. It was a blur of motion, impossibly fast. The guard dropped his light, his body slumping to the floor with a soft thud. No struggle, no sound, just incapacitation. It was too quick, too clean. The remaining figures continued their work, seemingly unfazed. They efficiently emptied the contents of two more containers, their movements a testament to practiced efficiency. As they finished, they resealed the containers, leaving no trace of their intrusion, save for the unconscious guard. They exited the warehouse as silently as they had entered, melting back into the encroaching dawn. The massive doors swung shut behind them, leaving the vast space cloaked in a deceptive stillness. I remained frozen on my perch, the adrenaline coursing through me, a bitter metallic taste in my mouth. This wasn't just a heist. This was a message, a demonstration of power. It was all there. The pattern was undeniable, and it was growing bolder, more brazen. The stakes, I realized with a sickening certainty, had just skyrocketed. And I was in the middle of it, whether I liked it or not. The air on the international bridge during shift change tasted of diesel fumes and the metallic tang of river water. A perpetual hum vibrated through the soles of my worn boots, a low thrumming that mirrored the unease coiling in my gut. Dusk was bleeding into the sky, smudging the horizon with bruised purples and fiery oranges. Lights began to wink on across the cityscape, distant stars in a burgeoning night. I'd driven out here on a hunch, a whisper of a feeling that the latest incident, a quiet snatch-and grab from a high-end art gallery, wasn't just another smash-and grab. The gallery owner, a man with hands as delicate as a surgeon's and eyes that had seen too much fine art, had spoken of precision. Not brute force, but elegance. A ballet of larceny, the same word a witness had used for the bank heist. And the jewelry exchange. I leaned against the cool concrete railing, the wind whipping strands of hair across my face. The bridge was a beast of steel and concrete, a ribbon connecting two worlds, and tonight it felt like a crossroads for my own fractured existence. The police had been here, a cursory sweep, chalk outlines long gone, the scent of their disinfectant fading. They saw petty criminals, opportunists. I saw a ghost. The gallery owner had mentioned a detail that snagged in my mind, a frayed thread I couldn't let go. Among the scattered shards of glass, a single perfectly preserved orchid had been found. Not dropped, he'd insisted, placed, as if for emphasis, a signature. My own past cases flashed behind my eyes, a reel of unsolved horrors. The florist killer, that's what the tabloids had called him. He'd left a single blood-red rose at each scene, a calling card that had haunted my dreams for years, a phantom I'd never managed to capture. And now, an orchid, a different bloom but the same deliberate artistry. A patrol car idled near the far end of the bridge, its occupants likely bored, watching the flow of traffic, the mundane rhythm of the city. They wouldn't see the subtle connections. They wouldn't feel the chill that had settled deep within me. They didn't know the weight of a failure that could still crush me. I pulled out my worn notebook, the pages dog-eared and smudged with ink. The bank, the jewelry exchange, the gallery, what connected them? It wasn't just the meticulous planning, the clean execution. It was the choice of targets, A small, unassuming bank in a forgotten corner of the city. A discreet, family-run jewelry store known for its antique pieces. Now, an art gallery specializing in impressionist works. They weren't the obvious targets. No flashing neon signs, no obvious riches screaming to be taken. They were quiet, almost secretive. I ran through the locations on a mental map. The bank was near a disused industrial district. The jewelry exchange was tucked away in a historic part of town, a labyrinth of narrow streets. The gallery was in a quiet, affluent neighborhood but set back from the main road, almost hidden. Each location had a sense of isolation. A place where things could happen unseen, and the orchid. Why an orchid? They weren't common. They were exotic, requiring specific conditions, a delicate touch to cultivate. Not something I'd find lying around. It implied preparation, intent. My fingers traced the ink of a hastily scribbled note from the gallery owner. He was careful, didn't disturb anything else, just took the one piece. The piece in question was a small, exquisite landscape, a sunrise over a misty moor. Insignificant in the grand scheme of the gallery's collection, but apparently the one thing the thief had come for. A sudden gust of wind buffeted me, rattling the metal structure of the bridge. I pulled my jacket tighter. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, surfaced. The florist killer's last known victim, a botanist. She'd been found in her greenhouse, surrounded by exotic plants, a single wilting rose clutched in her hand. The police had dismissed it as a morbid taunt. I'd seen it as a clue, a breadcrumb, but I'd lost the trail. Could this be him? After all these years, or someone who knew his methods, someone who admired him? I flipped to a fresh page in my notebook, my pen hovering. The bank, the jewelry exchange, the gallery. What was the common thread beyond the clandestine nature of their locations and the careful planning? I thought about the stolen items. A modest amount of cash from the bank, a few high-value antique rings from the jeweler, a single painting from the gallery. Nothing that screamed Master Thief's Haul. It was too selective, too personal. Then it hit me. A tremor ran through me, not from the wind, but from within. The botanist. She hadn't just cultivated plants, she'd specialized in rare orchids. My breath hitched. The orchid. This wasn't just a pattern of heists. This was a narrative. A twisted, deliberate narrative being written in the stolen objects and the carefully placed flowers. The detective who'd taken over the florist killer case after I was sidelined had called me a few weeks ago, asked if I'd heard anything. I'd said no, of course, but the question had planted a seed of doubt. Had he been studying the old files? Had he been looking for inspiration? The bridge hummed beneath me, a constant, low vibration. This wasn't just about stolen art or precious jewels. This was about a message, and I was starting to understand the language. A language of death and obsession, spoken in blossoms and stolen dreams. I had to find the next word before the sentence was finished. The international bridge during shift change was a symphony of hurried footsteps and the distant bleat of truck horns. Dusk, a bruised watercolor smear across the sky, bled into the river's murky expanse. I leaned against the cold, graffiti-scarred concrete railing, the same railing I'd stood against 1,000 nights ago, a younger, sharper Cole. Now the sharpness had dulled, replaced by a persistent ache behind my eyes, a phantom echo of the case that had broken me. My informant, a whisper in the shadows named Silas, had promised a name connected to the recent string of heists, a name that, if true, would twist the knot in my gut tighter. Silas dealt in whispers and secrets, his currency the fear he cultivated. He'd agreed to meet me here, at the nexus of transit and anonymity, where the world flowed and then dispersed. A figure detached itself from the gathering gloom near the toll booths. Tall, gaunt, draped in a coat that seemed to absorb the scant light. Silas. He moved with a predator's economy of motion, his eyes like chips of obsidian scanning the milling crowds. He stopped a few feet away, the river wind whipping strands of greasy hair across his face. Cole. His voice was a dry rustle, like dead leaves skittering across asphalt. I look like I've been wrestling with ghosts. Cut the poetry, Silas. I said I had something for me. I kept my voice low, even. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that prickles the skin. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Always direct, I like that. The heists. They're not random, not even close. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The pattern. It's the same hand that guided the Cobalt Killer all those years ago. My breath hitched. The Cobalt Killer. The name was a brand seared into my memory. A phantom I'd chased for years, only to watch him vanish, leaving a trail of meticulously planned chaos and unsolved murders. I rest sure, as sure as I am that the river will flow to the sea. Silas's gaze drifted to the flickering neon sign of a distant bar. The one who's orchestrating this. He's been watching, learning. A ghost from my past, Cole, someone I thought was buried. He took a step closer, his eyes locking onto mine. The man who walked away from the warehouse fire. The one I thought I saw go up in flames. My gut clenched. The warehouse fire. The supposed end of the Cobalt Killer. I'd been there, the smoke stinging my eyes, the heat scorching my lungs. I'd seen the flames engulf the building, heard the roar as it collapsed. But I hadn't seen a body, not one I could be certain of. Doubts, like persistent gnats, had buzzed at the edges of my certainty ever since. I rest saying he's alive. The question felt absurd, a betrayal of everything I'd believed. Alive and well and playing a very dangerous game. Silas reached into his coat, his movements slow and deliberate. He produced a folded piece of paper, creased and smudged. This is a name and an address. He's meeting someone tonight, someone who can give him what he needs for the next phase. I took the paper, my fingers brushing his. The address was in the industrial district, a labyrinth of disused factories and rusting machinery. And the person he's meeting? I asked, my gaze fixed on the scribbled address. That's where it gets interesting, Cole. Silas's lips curved into a sly smile. It's someone who owed someone I put away. The implications hit like a tidal wave. A resurrected killer, now allied with someone from my own past. This wasn't just a series of heists. It was a personal vendetta, a twisted game of revenge played out on the city's underbelly. Why tell me this, Silas? I asked, my voice tight. What's in it for I? Information is my lifeblood, Cole, and this is a story worth a king's ransom in secrets. He turned, melting back into the flow of people crossing the bridge. Be careful, detective. Some ghosts have very sharp teeth. I watched him go, the paper in my hand feeling like a live wire. The river below churned, its dark waters mirroring the turmoil inside me. The address, the name. I hailed a cab, the driver's weary eyes barely meeting mine in the rearview mirror. The ride to the industrial district was a blur of flickering streetlights and the growing, suffocating quiet of the city's forgotten corners. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp concrete and something metallic, like old blood. The designated meeting point was a derelict warehouse, its corrugated metal skin groaning under the weight of the wind. A single, bare bulb cast a sickly yellow circle of light near a gaping maw of an entrance. My gut screamed caution, but my feet carried me forward, drawn by an invisible, irresistible force. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of water somewhere in the cavernous space. Then I heard it. A low murmur of voices followed by the clink of metal. I crept closer, my senses on high alert. Peeking through a gap in some stacked crates, I saw them. Two figures silhouetted against the faint light filtering through a grimy window. One was tall, lean, his posture radiating an unnerving stillness. The other was shorter, stockier, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. Then the shorter figure turned. It was the man I'd put away for armed robbery years ago. The one whose testimony I'd relied on, the one who had betrayed me. His face, etched with a bitterness that had only deepened with time, was illuminated for a fleeting second. And the taller figure, as he turned, the light caught his profile. The sharp, aquiline nose, the set of his jaw, the unnerving calm in his eyes. It was him, alive and with my betrayer. A surge of adrenaline, hot and potent, coursed through me. This was it. The confrontation I'd been preparing for, the one I'd both sought and feared. I took a step forward, ready to make my presence known, ready to finally put an end to this nightmare. but as I moved, my boot scuffed against a loose piece of debris, a sharp, grating sound that echoed unnaturally in the vast space. The two figures froze. The murmur of voices ceased. Silence descended, thick and suffocating. Then slowly, deliberately, the taller figure turned his head in my direction. A low, guttural laugh rumbled from his chest. It was a sound devoid of humor, a sound that promised pain. "I've been expecting Cole," he said, his voice a silken thread woven with menace. Before I could react, before I could even draw my weapon, a heavy thud struck my head from behind. The paper with the address, Silas's last gift, slipped from my numb fingers, lost in the encroaching black. My mission, my chance for redemption, had just been brutally, irrevocably derailed. The cab tires sang a low hum against the asphalt, a monotonous lullaby as the city lights bled into streaks of neon. My knuckles were white where I gripped the worn paper, the address a beacon in the encroaching gloom. He'd given me a name, too, a ghost from my past, whispering from the shadows of a forgotten case. The International Bridge during shift change was my destination, a place where the world paused, a fleeting moment of stillness before the gears of commerce ground on. A fitting spot, I mused, for a man who dealt in stolen moments and shattered lives. The driver, a man whose face seemed etched with the weariness of 1,000 late nights, grunted an acknowledgement when I pointed to the bridge. The air grew colder, carrying the metallic tang of the river and something else, something sharp and acrid that tickled the back of my throat. My gaze drifted to the paper again, the elegant, looping script of the name. It stirred a memory, a phantom limb ache of a case I'd left unfinished, a killer I'd never caught. Was this him? Or was this a cruel imitation, a taunt delivered by a new hand playing the same deadly game? We approached the bridge, a colossal skeletal hand reaching across the dark water. The shift change was in full swing. A river of headlights flowed in one direction, a mirror image of taillights retreating. Security guards, their faces impassive, patrolled the perimeter, their movements precise and practiced. The air thrummed with a latent energy, a silent tension that always clung to these liminal spaces. I paid the driver, my mind already miles away, sifting through the fragments of evidence, the half-truths, the lingering questions. I walked onto the bridge, the wind whipping my coat around me. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming, a testament to human ambition and engineering. Below, the water was a churning, inky black, swallowing the faint moonlight. The paper felt damp in my hand. I unfolded it carefully. The address was a warehouse district, a place of forgotten industries and echoing emptiness. The name, I traced it with my finger. It was familiar, disturbingly so. I'd seen that name before, scrawled on a confession note that had never been sent, tucked away in a victim's belongings. A detail I'd dismissed, a loose thread I'd let slip through my fingers. Now it felt like a gauntlet thrown, the heists, the precision, the signature. A glint of metal caught my eye. A discarded cigarette lighter nestled in a crack in the concrete. I picked it up. It was heavy, ornate, with an embossed crest I didn't recognize. I turned it over in my palm. A small, insignificant object, yet it pulsed with an unspoken story. Was it his? A careless drop or a deliberate marker? I pulled out my phone, the screen a harsh rectangle against the dim light. I scrolled through old case files, my fingers flying across the virtual keyboard. The killer's M.O. The meticulous planning, the psychological manipulation, the theatrical flair. The victims, they weren't random. There was a pattern, a narrative woven through their lives, a story of betrayal and retribution. My breath hitched. I remembered a detail from one of the early interviews, a fleeting mention of a business partner, a man who had been wronged, swindled out of everything. The name had been forgotten, lost in the avalanche of evidence. The name on the paper, it matched. This wasn't just about stolen goods. This was personal. This was vengeance. And I had been so focused on the how that I'd missed the why. The perpetrator wasn't just a criminal mastermind. They were a victim, twisted by circumstance, seeking a twisted form of justice. I looked out at the endless flow of traffic, the anonymous faces behind the windshields. Each one a potential target, a pawn in a game I was only just beginning to understand. The heists were a prelude, a crescendo building to something far more devastating. Tall, lean, moving with an unnerving grace. My instincts screamed. I ducked back into the alcove, my heart racing a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Was this the perpetrator or a messenger? The figure stopped at the edge of the bridge, their gaze sweeping across the landscape. My eyes narrowed, it looked like a detonator. The puzzle pieces clicked into place, forming a terrifying picture. The warehouse. It wasn't just a storage facility. It was a trap, and the heists, they were a distraction, a carefully orchestrated diversion while the real prize was secured. The perpetrator wasn't just seeking revenge. They were trying to expose something, to force a reckoning. And I, Cole, the disgraced detective, was the only one who could stop them before their twisted justice consumed everything. The wind howled, carrying the distant wail of a siren, a sound that felt both like a warning and a promise. The truth was unraveling, and it was far more complex and dangerous than I had ever imagined. A ghost from my past, whispering from the shadows of a life I tried to bury. Now that ghost was reaching out, pulling me back into the mire. The destination was the International Bridge during shift change, a place where anonymity was currency and shadows clung to the underbelly of the towering steel. The cab pulled up to a service entrance, the air thick with the metallic tang of exhaust and the faint, unsettling aroma of brine. The driver, a man with eyes as vacant as a forgotten parking lot, didn't even look at me as he took the crumpled bills. He just wanted me gone. I stepped out, the wind whipping my coat around my legs. The bridge, a colossal serpent of concrete and steel, arched over the Inkai water, its lights a scattered constellation against the bruised twilight sky. Trucks rumbled, their headlights cutting through the fog, while smaller vehicles, like frantic gnats, swarmed the lanes. The air vibrated with the low thrum of engines and the distant wail of a siren, a mournful counterpoint to the steady rhythm of the night. She spoke of a connection, a thread that tied these audacious crimes not just to the phantom, but to me. I moved towards the designated meeting point, a cluster of maintenance sheds huddled beneath the bridge's colossal pylons. The concrete here was slick with a greasy film, reflecting the harsh glare of utilitarian lamps. A solitary figure stood by a rusting chain-link fence, silhouetted against the dim light. As I approached, the figure turned and my breath hitched. It was the woman. His face was a roadmap of hard living, etched with lines that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. "You're Cole," he stated, his voice raspy like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It wasn't a question. "And you are." I kept my voice level, my gaze sweeping the surroundings. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, met mine. "What matters is what they're planning, what they've already done." She unfolded a folded newspaper, the headlines screaming about the latest audacious robbery. Then with trembling fingers, she pointed to a small, blurry photograph tucked beneath the main article. The whole family and the man, the husband. He used to work with years ago, before. She trailed off, her gaze flickering away, a flicker of shared pain passing between us. My blood, which had been a slow simmer of unease, now felt like ice. The man in the photo, his name. It was a name I hadn't uttered in a decade, a name I tried to scrub from my memory like a stubborn stain. He'd been a junior officer, bright, eager, full of a naive optimism that the world had long since beaten out of him. He'd been one of the few who'd believed in me, even when the department had turned its back. Why? The word was barely a breath, lost in the roar of a passing truck. "Because he knows Ira looking," the woman said, her gaze returning, steady and unwavering. "He knows Ira, the only one who can connect the dots. He's not just stealing Cole, he's sending a message to you." The carefully constructed walls I'd built around my past began to crumble. This wasn't just about a phantom killer anymore. This was personal. The phantom wasn't just taunting the city, he was taunting me, and he'd chosen the most brutal way imaginable to do it. He'd weaponized my past, turning the faces of innocence into pawns in his twisted game. The bridge, once a symbol of connection, now felt like a precipice, and I was teetering on the edge. I had to find them. I had to stop him, before he erased another piece of my life. The air over the international bridge during shift change tasted of exhaust fumes and the metallic tang of anticipation. Below, the river churned, a dark, indifferent ribbon. I stood on the pedestrian walkway, the biting wind whipping my coat around my legs, a familiar chill that had nothing to do with the October air. My informant, a twitchy man whose name I'd already forgotten, had sworn this was the place. The next move. The Phantom's next masterpiece. I dismissed the informant's ramblings as the desperate lies of a cornered rat until he'd mentioned the specific brand of imported cigarettes, the ones the Phantom had been known to favor. A detail not released to the public, a detail that had lodged itself in my memory like a sliver of glass. The shift change was a symphony of grinding gears and honking horns. Trucks lumbered across the span, their headlights cutting through the deepening twilight. Uniformed figures, weary and ready to hand over their burdens, began to filter through the toll booths. It was a transient moment, a hinge point, and the Phantom, I suspected, loved such liminal spaces. I'd spent the last 48 hours piecing together the Phantom's pattern, not just the logistics of the heist, but the why, the audacity, the theatricality. It wasn't just about the stolen goods, it was about the message. And the message I finally understood was for me. Every meticulously planned robbery, every perfectly executed diversion was a gauntlet thrown at my feet. He was recreating his work, the work I'd failed to stop. My own demons, once a silent, brooding presence, now clamored for attention. The faces of the victims, their stories etched into my mind, felt fresh, raw. I'd left the force, buried myself in a quiet corner of the city, hoping the ghosts would fade. They hadn't. They'd merely been waiting, biding their time. And now they were back, wearing the Phantom's mask. The trap was simple, elegant in its desperation. I'd leaked information about a supposedly unguarded shipment of rare antiquities due to pass through this very crossing. A shipment I knew with absolute certainty would never arrive. The Phantom, with his obsession for the past, his penchant for the stolen remnants of history, would be drawn to it like a moth to a flame. I scanned the faces of the few pedestrians who braved the wind. A young couple, huddled together. A solitary figure with a worn leather bag. He paused near the railing, his back to me, and I felt a prickle of something akin to recognition. Not of his face, but of his stillness, a predator's stillness. I'd alerted a trusted contact within the department, a woman who owed me a favor, to have a discreet presence on the other side. No sirens, no grand arrests, just eyes, watching, waiting. My role was to be the bait, the lure. The Phantom's methods were precise, almost surgical. He never left a trace. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses who could offer more than a fleeting impression. But he left a psychological signature, a taunt woven into the fabric of his crimes. He was playing a game, and I was his unwilling opponent. I pulled out a crumpled pack of cigarettes, the same brand the informant had mentioned. The smoke burned my throat, a welcome distraction. There was no fear in his gaze, no surprise. He offered a faint, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and continued his walk, disappearing into the stream of departing shift workers. Was that him? Or was it another phantom, a ghost conjured by my own fractured mind? Doubt, a venomous serpent, began to coil in my gut. I'd been wrong before. My certainty had cost lives, but the cigarettes, the stillness, the shared understanding in that brief glance. It felt like a confirmation, a private acknowledgement. He knew I was here, he knew I was watching, and he was walking right past my bait. My heart, a traitorous organ, picked up a rhythm that felt too fast, too loud. This was it, the moment of truth. I took another drag of the cigarette, the smoke a veil between me and the world. I was a hunter, yes, but I was also the prey. And the Phantom, whoever he was, had just confirmed he was walking into the heart of my carefully laid trap. The tension was a physical thing, a tightening in my chest, a prickling on my skin. The game was far from over, but the board had just been set for the final, devastating move. The wind off the river was a thief, stealing the warmth from my skin and leaving behind a brittle, exposed feeling. The international bridge during shift change hummed with a low, guttural energy, the rumble of idling engines. the distant clang of metal, the hushed urgency of voices on radios. I'd chosen this place, this liminal space between nations, between day and night, because it felt like the edge of everything. The edge of my sanity, the edge of the truth. My gaze swept across the skeletal framework of the bridge, the lights of passing vehicles painting fleeting streaks on the wet asphalt. My contact, a nervous ferryman I'd met in a smoky dive bar near the docks, was supposed to be here. He'd promised information, a name, a face to put to the phantom terror that had been stalking my life. He'd spoken of a meeting, a handover of a ledger right here, under the indifferent gaze of the moon. A shadow detached itself from the concrete abutment, coalescing into a figure, not the ferryman. This one was different, taller, leaner, moving with a predatory grace that sent a jolt through me, a primal recognition I tried to bury deep. The way he held himself, the subtle tilt of his head as he surveyed the scene, it was a mirror, a twisted reflection of something I knew intimately. Cole. The voice was a low rasp, like gravel skittering across stone. It was the voice I'd heard in my nightmares, the one that had echoed in the empty rooms of my past. My breath hitched. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The ferryman was meant to be a conduit, a stepping stone. This was the source. I managed, the word a dry cough. He stepped further into the dim light cast by a flickering sodium lamp. His face was obscured by the shadow of his cap, but I could feel his eyes on me, dissecting, appraising. A knife, this is ruin, this is death. He chuckled, a soft, unsettling sound. Innovation, detective, evolution of the craft, you of all people should appreciate that. The mention of my former profession, of my past failure, struck a raw nerve. I took a step forward, my fists clenching at my sides. You think you're so clever, don't you? Copying him, you think you're him. A pause, the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then he laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. Copying. My dear Cole, I am the refinement, the apotheosis. He was. A crude sketch, I am the finished masterpiece. That was it. The phantom I'd hunted, the one who'd vanished into the ether after his string of brutal killings, was alive. And he was here, or rather his successor, or was it him? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but the confidence, the almost artistic flair, it was new. Where is he? I demanded, my voice rough. Where is the original? He took a step closer, the knife glinting. He's no longer relevant, a discarded tool. The future is now Cole, and it belongs to me. He lunged. The bridge, moments before a silent sentinel, became a battlefield. The clang of metal on metal echoed in the night as I deflected his knife with my own improvised weapon, a sturdy piece of rebar I'd scavenged from a construction site earlier that day. He moved with a speed that belied his lean frame, a blur of motion in the gloom. Each strike was precise, aimed at vital points, a calculated dance of death. I parried, dodged, felt the sting of shallow cuts on my arms, the searing pain as the rebar scraped against my knuckles. The exhaust fumes choked me, the damp air clinging to my sweat-slicked skin. This wasn't just a fight for my life. It was a fight for my soul. Every blow landed was a blow against the ghosts that haunted me, the faces of the victims I'd failed to protect. He was good, terrifyingly good. He anticipated my moves, countered my desperate lunges with unnerving ease. He was a ghost made flesh, a phantom with a blade. I saw it then in the flicker of his eyes, the slight smirk that played on his lips. He was enjoying this, still living in the past. "And a coward," I growled, shoving his back, hiding behind someone else's legacy. That hit a nerve. His eyes narrowed, and his next attack was a flurry of wild, vicious blows. I managed to weave through them, feeling the air displaced by the whistling steel inches from my face. I saw an opening, a fraction of a second, where his guard dropped. I lunged, not with the rebar but with my body, tackling him. We tumbled to the ground, the impact jarring my teeth. The knife skittered away, clattering against the concrete. He was stronger than he looked, his limbs wiry and powerful. We grappled, our breaths ragged, the sounds of our struggle lost in the constant thrum of the bridge. I felt the rough texture of the asphalt beneath my cheek, tasted the metallic tang of blood from a split lip. He twisted, trying to pin me, his face inches from mine. In the dim light, I saw his eyes. They were wild, desperate, and filled with a profound, gnawing emptiness. "I think this is about him," he rasped, his voice cracking. "This is about them. They all deserve it." And then I understood. This wasn't just a copycat. This was someone consumed by a twisted sense of justice, someone who saw the world through a lens of vengeance. He wasn't just inspired by the past, he was drowning in it. He managed to break free, scrambling to his feet. He lunged for the knife. I was faster. I kicked out, sending the weapon skittering further away. He roared in frustration, turning his gaze back to me. The wind whipped around him, tugging at his clothes, threatening to pull him over. "It's over," I said, my voice steady, though my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "It's finally over." He looked at me, his eyes blazing with a dangerous mixture of defiance and despair. Then, with a guttural cry, he turned and leaped. He was gone. The river, indifferent as always, claimed its prize. The wind, a thief of breath and sound, whipped across the expanse of the international bridge during shift change. It tugged at my coat, a phantom hand urging me back from the precipice where the stranger had vanished. Below, the river churned, a murky maw that had swallowed him whole or had it. The spray from the churning water misted my face, cold and sharp. My knuckles were white where I gripped the railing, the metal biting into my skin. He was gone, a ghost like the one that had been my shadow for years. But the echo of his defiant cry, a raw shard of despair, still vibrated in the air. I stood there, a statue carved from regret, as the city lights began to bloom defiant sparks against the encroaching indigo. Headlights traced luminous paths across the asphalt, a silent ballet of metal and purpose. The air thrummed with the low growl of engines, the distant wail of a siren, the mundane pulse of a world that continued, oblivious to the precipice I just witnessed. My gaze swept the vast steel structure, searching for a glint of fabric, a ripple in the water, anything to confirm the finality of it all. Nothing, just the relentless, indifferent flow. My own breath hitched, ragged and unsteady. Had I imagined the whole thing, the stranger's words, a desperate confession laced with a twisted logic, replayed in my mind? He claimed to be finishing what the killer I'd failed to catch had started. A protege, a mirror, a final, corrupted flourish. But the conviction in his eyes, that blazing desperation, felt too real to be an illusion. Slowly, I turned away from the river's hungry embrace. My body ached with a weariness that went deeper than bone. The investigation, a relentless tide that had pulled me from the quiet shores of my self-imposed exile, had finally receded, leaving behind a landscape of exhaustion. Each solved piece had felt like a victory, a small reclamation of lost ground. A colleague approached, their footsteps a soft percussion on the metal walkway. "Cole, I all right?" The voice was laced with concern, a familiar sound that had once been a comfort, now a stark reminder of the life I'd abandoned. I nodded, forcing my lips into a semblance of a smile. "Just," the stranger had confessed in his own fractured way. He'd laid bare the mechanics of the heists, the network he'd built, the warped legacy he'd inherited. He'd even revealed the final resting place of the original killer's trophies, a grim testament to a madness that had festered for years. It was all there, laid out like a dissected corpse, the truth stark and ugly. But as I walked away from the railing, my gaze fell on a small, tarnished object caught on a bolt near where the stranger had stood. It was a locket, intricately engraved, the kind that held secrets close. My heart gave a strange, discordant lurch. I'd seen that locket before, not on the stranger, but in the evidence photos from the original case. A detail that had been deemed insignificant, lost in the larger, more terrifying narrative. I knelt, my fingers brushing against the cool metal. It was identical, but the stranger had claimed to be a follower, an imitator. Why would he possess such a personal item of the original killer? Unless... The stranger's confession, his entire narrative, had felt a little too neat, a little too convenient. Had I been so eager for resolution, so desperate to finally close the book on my past, that I'd accepted a story that wasn't entirely true, the stranger had leapt. But the locket, this tangible piece of the past, remained. The case might be closed, the heist stopped, but the real resolution, the true unraveling of the threads that had haunted me for so long, felt further away than ever. The wind howled again, carrying with it not an ending but a question.